In the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, as Japanese aircraft screamed down from the skies over Pearl Harbor, there was a prevailing sentiment among Japan's military leadership that would prove to be catastrophically wrong. They believed America was soft. They believed that the democracy across the Pacific, with its jazz music, its Hollywood films, and its consumer culture, lacked the warrior spirit necessary to endure a prolonged and bloody conflict. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, famously warned his superiors that they had awakened a sleeping giant. But many in Tokyo's War Council dismissed such concerns. They were convinced that after a few devastating blows, the Americans would sue for peace, unwilling to pay the price in blood the total war demanded. They could not have been more wrong. What Japan failed to understand was that beneath the veneer of American prosperity lay an industrial capacity unlike anything the world had ever seen. And more importantly, they underestimated the American capacity for righteous fury. Within just 2 years of Pearl Harbor, that fury would manifest itself in the form of a weapon so devastating, so relentless, that it would reduce Japan's cities to ash and bring the empire to its knees. That weapon was the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress, and the campaign it would unleash represented one of the most devastating aerial offensives in human history. If you're fascinated by these incredible stories of World War II, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Click the notification bell so you never miss another video, and if you're enjoying this content, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, to understand just how profoundly Japan misjudged American resolve, we need to go back to the mindset that prevailed in Tokyo during the early years of the war. Japanese military planners had studied the American character, or so they thought. They had observed the isolationist sentiment that gripped the nation throughout the 1930s. They had noted the reluctance of American mothers to send their sons to fight in distant lands. They had calculated that a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, accustomed to comfort and convenience, would never possess the stomach for the kind of brutal, uncompromising warfare that Japan's samurai tradition had perfected over centuries. This wasn't mere arrogance, though arrogance certainly played a role. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what drove the American spirit. Japan's leaders saw America's reluctance to enter the war as weakness, when in reality it was restraint. They saw democracy as inefficient, when it was actually resilient. And they saw American industrial capacity as a tool for producing consumer goods, failing to recognize that the same factories churning out automobiles and refrigerators could, with terrifying speed, be converted to produce instruments of war on a scale that would dwarf anything Japan could muster. The B-29 Super Fortress was the ultimate expression of this industrial might. When Boeing engineers first began designing this aircraft in 1938, they were creating something that existed at the very edge of technological possibility. The specifications called for a bomber that could fly higher than any fighter could intercept, farther than any existing aircraft could travel, and carry a bomb load that would make previous bombers look like toys. It was, in every sense, a weapon of the future being built in the present. The challenges were immense. The B-29 would need to fly at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the air was so thin that crews would lose consciousness without pressurized cabins. It would need engines powerful enough to lift over 60,000 pounds of aircraft and bombs into the stratosphere, yet reliable enough to sustain flights of over 3,000 miles. It would need defensive armament sophisticated enough to fend off swarms of enemy fighters, and navigation equipment precise enough to hit targets from miles above the earth. What emerged from Boeing's factories was a marvel of engineering. The B-29 featured a pressurized cabin that allowed crews to work in shirt-sleeve comfort at altitudes where the outside temperature plunged to 60 degrees below zero. It boasted remote-controlled gun turrets that could be operated by a single gunner using an advanced computing site. Its 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each producing over 2,000 horsepower, gave it a top speed exceeding 350 miles per hour and a service ceiling above 31,000 feet. At the time of its introduction, it was the most expensive weapon system ever developed, costing more than the Manhattan Project that would eventually produce the atomic devices. But having a revolutionary weapon and using it effectively are two very different things. And this is where the story becomes truly compelling. The initial plan for deploying B-29s against Japan was codenamed Operation Matterhorn, and it was, to put it diplomatically, a logistical nightmare. The idea was to base the bombers in China, flying supplies over the Himalayas from India in what became known as the Hump. The challenges were staggering. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown over the highest mountains on Earth. For every mission the B-29s flew against Japan, it took 7 supply missions over the Hump just to provide the necessary fuel and ordnance. The first B-29 raid against the Japanese home islands took place on June 15, 1944, when 68 aircraft took off from bases around Chengdu, China, to strike the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata, on the island of Kyushu. It was a symbolic moment, the first time American bombs had fallen on Japan since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier. But the results were far from encouraging. Of the 68 aircraft that took off, only 47 actually reached the target. The rest turned back due to mechanical failures, got lost, or ran out of fuel. Of those that did reach Yawata, only a handful actually hit anywhere near the target. 1 bomb struck the factory, 1 single bomb. The Japanese were relieved. These American bombers that had been so hyped, these technological marvels that were supposed to bring Japan to its knees, had barely scratched them. Perhaps their assessment of American capabilities had been correct after all. But what the Japanese failed to realize was that America was just getting started. The problems with Operation Matterhorn weren't a reflection of American weakness. They were the inevitable growing pains of deploying a revolutionary weapon system under impossible conditions. And even as those first disappointing raids were being conducted from China, a far more significant development was taking place thousands of miles to the east. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had fallen to American forces in the summer of 1944, after some of the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War. The strategic significance of these islands cannot be overstated. They were close enough to Japan, roughly 1,500 miles, that B-29s could strike the home islands and return without the logistical nightmare of the China operations. Construction crews, many of them Seabees, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions worked around the clock to build the massive runways necessary for the B-29s. These weren't ordinary airstrips. The B-29, loaded with fuel and bombs, needed nearly 2 miles of runway to get airborne. The construction effort was itself a testament to American industrial capability. On Tinian alone, 6 runways were built, each over 8,000 feet long. At the time, it was the busiest airfield in the world. The first B-29s of the 21st Bomber Command began arriving in the Marianas in October 1944, and the man in charge was Brigadier General Haywood Hansell. Hansell was a true believer in the doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing. The idea was straightforward in theory: fly above the reach of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, identify key industrial targets, and systematically destroy Japan's ability to wage war. It was clean, it was logical, and it reflected the American desire to win the war through technological superiority and industrial targeting, rather than through the indiscriminate destruction of civilian areas. The first raid from the Marianas came on November 24, 1944, when over 100 B-29s took off from Saipan to strike the Nakajima aircraft engine plant near Tokyo. This was a crucial target. the Nakajima plant produced a significant percentage of Japan's aircraft engines. Destroy it, and you cripple Japan's ability to replace the aircraft being shot down in ever-increasing numbers. But something happened on that mission that would haunt the B-29 crews for months to come. As the bombers climbed to their bombing altitude of around 30,000 feet, they encountered a phenomenon that their meteorologists had warned them about, but that they weren't truly prepared for: the jet stream. This river of air, flowing at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, turned precision bombing into a cruel joke. Bombs released at 30,000 feet were blown miles off course. Bombardiers, using their sophisticated Norden bomb sights, found their carefully calculated solutions rendered meaningless by winds that changed speed and direction unpredictably. The results were, once again, disappointing. Only about 24 of the 111 aircraft that took off actually bombed the primary target, and of those bombs, very few hit anywhere near the factory. The Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, though unable to reach the high-flying bombers consistently, put up enough flak to rattle the crews, and Japanese fighters, though struggling to reach the B-29's altitude, managed to shoot down one bomber and damage several others. Over the next few months, Hansel's command flew mission after mission against Japanese industrial targets, and the results remained frustratingly poor. The jet stream made accurate bombing nearly impossible. The constant cloud cover over Japan meant that bombardiers often couldn't even see their targets. Mechanical failures, particularly with the troublesome R-3350 engines, caused losses that had nothing to do with enemy action. Crews would nurse their wounded aircraft back toward the Marianas, only to ditch in the Pacific when engines gave out. The Japanese, monitoring these raids, began to relax. Yes, the Americans were persistent. They would give them that. But the damage being inflicted was manageable. Factories hit one week were back in operation the next. The great silver bombers that filled the skies seemed more of an annoyance than an existential threat. In Tokyo, war planners continued to believe they could outlast American resolve. Surely, they reasoned, the Americans would grow tired of these costly and ineffective missions. Surely the home front would demand an end to a campaign that was costing lives and resources without delivering decisive results. Japan had prepared for a long war, storing materials, dispersing industries, training civilians for defense. They would endure. What they didn't know was that their endurance was about to be tested in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. In January 1945, a change in command occurred that would alter the course of the air war and, ultimately, the fate of Japan itself. General Curtis LeMay, a young, aggressive officer who had made his reputation running bombing operations in Europe, was brought in to replace Hansel. LeMay was not a man given to sentiment or half-measures. He looked at the results from the high-altitude precision bombing campaign and saw a failed strategy. The jet stream, the cloud cover, the mechanical problems, all of it added up to an approach that simply wasn't working. LeMay spent weeks analyzing the problem from every angle. He studied Japanese air defenses and found them surprisingly weak, especially at night and at lower altitudes. The Japanese had invested heavily in fighters designed to intercept at high altitude, but their night fighter capabilities were primitive. Their anti-aircraft guns were optimized for high-altitude targets. Their radar systems, while improving, were nowhere near as sophisticated as those the Germans had deployed. Then LeMay made a decision that would have profound and terrible consequences. If high-altitude precision bombing wasn't working, he would try something radically different. He would send his B-29s in at low altitude at night, stripped of much of their defensive armament, to allow them to carry more ordnance. And instead of high-explosive bombs designed to destroy industrial machinery, he would fill those bomb bays with incendiary devices designed to start fires. The reasoning was coldly logical. Japanese cities were tinderboxes. Traditional construction relied heavily on wood and paper. Houses were packed closely together in dense urban neighborhoods. Japanese industry, moreover, wasn't concentrated in large factories the way American or German industry was. Much of Japan's war production came from small workshops scattered throughout residential areas, cottage industries where families produced components that would be assembled in larger facilities. You couldn't destroy this dispersed industrial base with precision bombing, but you could destroy it with fire. On the night of March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House was launched. It remains to this day the single most destructive air raid in human history. 334 B-29s took off from the Marianas carrying a mixture of M69 incendiary bombs, each cluster containing 38 individual bomblets that would scatter on impact and burst into flames fed by napalm gel. The target was Tokyo, specifically the working-class residential districts of the eastern part of the city, where population density exceeded 100,000 people per square mile. The Pathfinder aircraft arrived first, marking out the target area with incendiary bombs to create a burning ring around the target zone. Then the main force arrived, and for over 2 hours they methodically dropped their payloads into the box of fire. The conditions were perfect for conflagration. A strong wind was blowing that night, and the closely packed wooden houses caught fire almost instantly. Within minutes, the individual fires had merged into a firestorm, a self-sustaining hurricane of flame that created its own wind system, pulling in oxygen from surrounding areas and generating temperatures hot enough to boil water in canals. The B-29 crews, flying at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, could smell the burning city. The updrafts from the firestorm were so powerful that aircraft at higher altitudes were tossed around like toys. The heat was intense enough that crews in the lower-flying bombers could feel it through the floor of their aircraft. Some reported that the smell of burning flesh penetrated their aircraft even at altitude. On the ground, the scene was apocalyptic. Residents who had survived previous raids, who had dutifully practiced fire drills and believed they could manage the situation, found themselves facing something utterly beyond their experience. The fire moved faster than people could run. Canals that residents had counted on as fire breaks became death traps as the water boiled. People seeking shelter in supposedly fire-resistant concrete buildings suffocated as the firestorm consumed all available oxygen. Families were separated in the chaos, never to find each other again. By dawn, roughly 16 square miles of Tokyo had been completely destroyed. The official figures, and these are almost certainly underestimates, put the number of people who lost their lives that night at over 80,000. Some estimates go as high as 100,000 or more. Over 1 million people were left without homes. The industrial output of that section of Tokyo, all those small workshops producing components for the war effort, was eliminated in a single night. General LeMay later recalled that the smoke from the burning city rose to over 15,000 feet, and that crews could smell it for 150 miles on their return journey to the Marianas. The Japanese military leadership was stunned. They had prepared for American air raids, but nothing like this. Their civil defense preparations, their firefighting equipment, their shelters, none of it had been adequate for a firestorm of this magnitude. And they knew with sickening certainty that if the Americans could do this to Tokyo, they could do it to every city in Japan. And that is exactly what LeMay intended. In the weeks following the Tokyo firestorm, B-29s struck one Japanese city after another. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, each received the same treatment. The missions followed a similar pattern: night raids at low altitude, incendiary bombs, and the systematic reduction of urban areas to ash. The B-29s were flying so many missions that they began to run low on incendiary bombs, and operations had to be temporarily suspended while new supplies were brought in from the United States. Let me take a moment here to ask you something. If you've made it this far into the video, you're clearly as passionate about this history as I am. Would you do me a favor? Drop a comment below telling me which aspect of this story you find most compelling. Is it the technological achievement of the B-29, the strategic decisions made by commanders like LeMay, or the human cost of this campaign? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. We've got so much more incredible history to explore together. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the systematic destruction of Japan's cities. As the spring of 1945 turned to summer, the B-29 campaign intensified. LeMay's super fortresses were now striking multiple cities in a single night. The Japanese air defense system, never robust against low-altitude night attacks, was being systematically dismantled. Fighter aircraft that might have intercepted the bombers were grounded due to fuel shortages, as American submarines had effectively cut off Japan's oil imports. Anti-aircraft ammunition was being rationed. Radar stations were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The Japanese government attempted to relocate industries to underground facilities and to rural areas, but these efforts came too late and were too disorganized to make a significant difference. The damage had already been done to much of Japan's industrial capacity. Moreover, the raids were destroying not just factories, but the transportation networks that connected them, the workers who operated them, and the materials that supplied them. By June 1945, LeMay's command had largely run out of major industrial targets. The big cities had been systematically destroyed, so the B-29s turned their attention to smaller cities, methodically working their way down a list of urban areas that had previously been too insignificant to warrant attention. Before each raid, American aircraft would drop leaflets warning residents to evacuate, listing which cities would be hit next. The psychological impact of these warnings was profound. Civilians lived in constant fear, never knowing if their city would be next on the list. It's important to pause here and consider what this campaign meant for ordinary Japanese citizens, people who had no say in the war their government had started, who were simply trying to survive. Millions were made refugees, fleeing burning cities with whatever possessions they could carry. Food distribution networks collapsed. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Children were evacuated to the countryside, separated from their parents. The social fabric of Japanese society was being torn apart, and yet Japan's military leadership refused to surrender. There were multiple reasons for this, some rational, some deeply irrational. The military code of Bushido, with its emphasis on fighting to the end, held powerful sway. The military government feared that surrender would mean the abolition of the imperial system and possibly the execution of the emperor as a war criminal. Some leaders genuinely believed that if they could just inflict enough casualties on an American invasion force, they could negotiate better terms. And some, perhaps, simply couldn't accept that all the sacrifice, all the lives lost, had been for nothing. The Americans, meanwhile, were planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The projected casualties were staggering, with some estimates suggesting that an invasion could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives, both military and civilian. The Japanese were mobilizing their entire population for a final defense of the homeland, training civilians, including women and children, to fight with sharpened bamboo spears if necessary. Back in the skies over Japan, the B-29 campaign continued its relentless destruction. By mid-summer 1945, there were few cities of significant size that hadn't been touched by the incendiary raids. The total square mileage of urban area destroyed was approaching 180 square miles, more than the combined destruction of every major German city bombed during the European air campaign. The Japanese war economy had effectively ceased to function. Oil refineries, already starved of crude oil by the submarine blockade, had been reduced to rubble. Aircraft factories that had once produced thousands of planes per month were now producing dozens. The Japanese Navy, once the pride of the empire, was largely confined to port, lacking the fuel to operate. Yet still, the war continued. It was in this context that the decision was made to use a new weapon that had been secretly developed in the deserts of New Mexico. The atomic device, a weapon of almost unimaginable destructive power, was now ready for deployment. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian carrying a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The target was Hiroshima, a city that had been deliberately spared from the incendiary campaign specifically so that the effects of the new weapon could be accurately assessed. At 8:15 in the morning, local time, the bomb was released. 43 seconds later, it detonated approximately 1,900 feet above the city center. In an instant, a flash of light brighter than the sun incinerated everything within a half-mile radius. The temperature at ground zero reached several thousand degrees. People simply vanished, leaving only shadows burned into concrete. The blast wave that followed flattened buildings for miles in every direction. And then came the fires, ignited by the thermal pulse and spreading rapidly through the rubble. The exact number who perished that day will never be known with certainty. Immediate casualties were estimated at 70,000 to 80,000, but this number would climb significantly in the following weeks and months as radiation sickness claimed more victims. By the end of 1945, the total had reached perhaps 140,000. Still, Japan did not immediately surrender. The military leadership, incredibly, tried to downplay the attack, claiming it was just a large conventional bomb. They couldn't admit, even to themselves, that a single aircraft carrying a single bomb could destroy an entire city. 3 days later, a second atomic device, this one a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Again, the destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Approximately 40,000 people lost their lives immediately, with the total eventually reaching 70,000. It was after Nagasaki that Emperor Hirohito made the unprecedented decision to intervene in the government's deliberations. Breaking with tradition, he announced that Japan must endure the unendurable and accept the Allied surrender terms. Even then, there was an attempted coup by military officers who wanted to continue the fight, but it was suppressed, and on August 15th, the Emperor's recorded surrender announcement was broadcast to the Japanese people. The war was over. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan, they found a country in ruins. 67 major cities had been significantly damaged or destroyed by the B-29 campaign. Millions were homeless. The economy had collapsed. Food shortages were severe. The proud Japanese military, which just 4 years earlier had conquered a vast empire stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific, was completely broken. For the Japanese leadership, there was a bitter irony in their defeat. They had gone to war believing that America was soft, that democracy made a nation weak, that industrial capitalism produced comfort-seeking citizens incapable of sacrifice. What they discovered too late was that they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. America wasn't soft. It was simply reluctant to go to war. Once provoked, once that sleeping giant was truly awakened, it demonstrated a capacity for industrial production and sustained military effort that dwarfed anything Japan could match. The B-29 campaign was the ultimate expression of this misunderstanding. Those sleek silver bombers, products of American engineering genius and industrial might, represented everything Japan had underestimated. Each aircraft was a triumph of technology, from its pressurized cabin to its remote-controlled gun turrets to its sophisticated navigation equipment. The fact that America could produce nearly 4,000 of these incredibly complex aircraft train tens of thousands of crew members to operate them, and supply them with millions of tons of fuel and ordnance, all while simultaneously fighting a war in Europe, was a feat that Japan simply could not have replicated. Moreover, the strategic thinking behind the campaign, the willingness to adapt tactics when initial approaches failed, the logistical brilliance of building massive air bases on captured islands, the relentless escalation of the bombing despite setbacks, all of this demonstrated a determined ruthlessness that Japan had not believed America possessed. There were those in Japan who had warned about underestimating America. Admiral Yamamoto himself, having studied in the United States, had tried to caution against war, knowing that America's industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Japan. But his warnings went unheeded, dismissed by those who confused American reluctance to fight with inability to fight. The human cost of this miscalculation was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians perished in the B-29 raids, their lives sacrificed on the altar of their government's hubris. The cities they had built over centuries were reduced to ash in a matter of months. An entire generation was traumatized by the experience of living through nightly terror from the skies. On the American side, the B-29 crews paid their own price. Despite flying against weakened defenses, losses mounted. Aircraft went down due to mechanical failures, accidents, and enemy action. The psychological toll of night after night of incendiary raids weighed on many crews. They knew what their bombs were doing to the cities below. Some carried that burden for the rest of their lives. The debate over the morality of the strategic bombing campaign continues to this day. Some historians argue that it was a necessary evil, that it shortened the war and ultimately saved lives by making an invasion unnecessary. Others contend that the deliberate targeting of civilian areas crossed a moral line that should never have been crossed. LeMay himself reportedly said that if America had lost the war, he fully expected to be tried as a war criminal. What is beyond debate is the sheer scale and effectiveness of the campaign from a military perspective. The B-29s achieved what conventional military operations could not. They brought the war directly to the Japanese home islands, destroying the industrial base that sustained the war effort and breaking the will of the population to continue fighting. In doing so, they validated the theories of strategic air power that had been debated since World War I. The legacy of the B-29 campaign extends beyond World War II. It demonstrated, in the most brutal terms possible, the potential for air power to determine the outcome of wars. It showed that no nation, no matter how determined or how fortified, could hide from the reach of a truly committed aerial assault. And it foreshadowed the Cold War doctrine of mutually assured destruction, where nuclear-armed bombers could reach any target on Earth. For Japan, the experience of those devastating raids fundamentally reshaped the national character. The nation that emerged from the ashes was determined never again to pursue military conquest. The post-war Constitution, written under American occupation but embraced by the Japanese people, renounced war as a sovereign right. Japan channeled the same energy and discipline that had once built a military empire into building an economic one, becoming an industrial powerhouse through peaceful means. It's worth noting that in the decades following the war, former enemies became close allies. American and Japanese veterans met, shared stories, and found common ground in their shared humanity. The cities that were destroyed were rebuilt, often more modern and efficient than before. Tokyo, once reduced to rubble, became one of the world's great metropolises. The relationship between the United States and Japan transformed into one of the most important alliances in the post-war world. But those who lived through the B-29 raids never forgot. Every August, memorial services are held throughout Japan, remembering those who were lost. Survivors share their stories with younger generations, ensuring that the lessons of that terrible time are not forgotten. And in museums and monuments across Japan, the artifacts of the air raids, burned objects, twisted metal, survivors' testimonies, serve as reminders of what happens when nations underestimate their enemies and when wars are allowed to escalate to their ultimate destructive potential. The story of the B-29 campaign against Japan is ultimately a story about the dangers of miscalculation in war. Japan's leaders, blinded by their own assumptions about national character and military prowess, failed to understand the true nature of the enemy they had provoked. They saw America's prosperity as decadence rather than strength. They saw democracy as weakness rather than resilience. They saw industrial capacity as a tool for comfort rather than a weapon of war. 2 years after Pearl Harbor, as those silver B-29s began appearing in Japanese skies, the reality began to set in. But by then, it was too late. The giant had awakened, and its fury was terrible to behold. The very qualities that Japan had dismissed as weaknesses, American innovation, industrial might, democratic determination, became the instruments of Japan's defeat. As we reflect on this history, separated by decades from those events, we can draw lessons that remain relevant today. The danger of underestimating adversaries, the terrible cost of total war, the importance of understanding other cultures and nations rather than relying on stereotypes and assumptions, these lessons paid for in blood and fire remain as important now as they were then. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of the most significant aerial campaigns in military history. If you found this video informative, please show your support by liking and subscribing. Share it with others who appreciate learning about these pivotal moments in history. And please, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this topic. What aspects of the B-29 campaign do you find most significant? How do you think it changed the nature of warfare? I look forward to reading your perspectives. Until next time, remember that understanding our past, even its darkest chapters, is essential for building a better future.